everybody. Glad to see y'all here this morning. Bill left off at chapter 15 of Proverbs, verse 27. Of course, in this particular section, Solomon is continuing to contrast between the wise and the foolish, which he does quite a bit in this book. A lot of good lessons here. And these are ideas that are, associated with either accepting or rejecting God's truth. And of course, the wise man accepts God's truth, and the fool rejects it. And he contrasts a lot of attitudes that different things that individuals will do and say and think and things along that line. And this, a lot of good thoughts in this chapter. Hopefully, we'll finish this chapter and move into the 16th chapter a little bit today. It just depends on how many comments and things are made. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he will, to lead our minds in prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we come thanking you for your love for us, and giving us a night of rest, and giving us this opportunity together to study with your holy and divine word. We pray, Father, that you would illuminate some ways to live life with us. We pray, Father, that we could glean something from it, and be better servants to it. We're thankful for your Son, Jesus, whose love and sacrifice. We still give you the praise.
All right, so let's look at verse 27. He that is greedy of gain troubleth his own house, but he that hateth bribes shall live. So Solomon here is kind of reflecting on the really can be tragic results of somebody being greedy. And the scripture notes that sinful choices include greed, and states that the Lord is far from the wicked, but close enough to the ones who do His will. And obviously, the Lord doesn't like people who are greedy. And people who engage in greed and other immoral attitudes also, they kind of put their families at risk. And you think about people who are chronic gamblers. They always want to get the next big payoff or something like that. And anybody that that knows anything about gambling knows that the house holds all the odds. You might win a couple of times, but in the long run, you're not gonna lose. When I was little, my dad came up with a slot machine, a nickel slot. So we decided one time what we wanted to do is we wanted to see what the odds were. So we took $10 of nickels, and we ran it. Of course, we weren't going to lose anything because it was our slot machine, our nickels. But we ran the thing through, and we did it several times, and we figured out for every $10 that you put in the thing, you're gonna win between $2 and $3. So that's not very good. That's not very good odds. Now, there was a couple of times kind of hit the big money. Got $4 or $5, but if you keep playing it, you're going to lose. So it's a losing property. What? Oh yeah. You say you hit one, and you say, well, let's see if we can get lucky. Yeah. And I think probably in all the years I maybe hit the jackpot one time, and the jackpot, I think that nickel slot was like, I don't know, $10, something like that. It looked really good because there was a window there. Matter of fact, I've still got the thing. It's probably 80 years old now, but this is a losing proposition. So the person who's inclined toward honest gain, and the honest person, they don't like bribes. And even in our society, people who take bribes, we kind of look down on. And it's not to say that it doesn't go on all the time. And in other countries, that's just kind of the way you do business. But just because other people do it doesn't make it necessarily right. So the person who is smart is the one who doesn't get into situations like this, and they stay away from it. Now, Joshua accused Achan of troubling Israel, and God had forbidden Israel from taking, pretty much anything from the conquered city of Jericho. But Achan, he disobeyed this. He just could not get past the point. He saw all these great things, and he just absolutely couldn't resist. And not only did it bring problems for him, but it brought problems to all his family. What ended up happening to him? The Lord took him out, and it looked good on paper, and he just couldn't get past that. And it's the same with people who are greedy. They just can't get past getting one more thing and wanting one more thing, and that drives their life. And the sad thing about it is they miss a lot of good things by scheming to how they're going to get the next, little payoff or get that next little bit of money. And we've said it a lot of times. In the end, you can't take it with you. And they miss out on a lot of good things, and in a lot of situations, their families do also. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 28. The heart of the righteous studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. So this relates to the proverb which we talked about back in verse 2, which kind of distinguishes between the wise tongue and the one that pours out folly. And it also kind of reflects a principle that back in verse 18, which commands us to be slow to anger. So the righteous and wisdom and humility and self-control are closely tied together in the book of Proverbs. We talk a lot about righteousness. We talk a lot about wisdom and humility and self-control. A righteous person doesn't just blurt out the first thing that comes to their mind. Instead, they carefully think about what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, and come out with the right type of answer that's not only going to reflect good on them, but it's also going to reflect well on the Lord. And unlike the righteous person who ponders the answer, the wicked person pretty much whatever comes to his mind, that's what comes out of his mouth. And a lot of times it's pure foolishness. Now the term that's translated evil in some of the translation here does not just refer to immorality, but it also it refers to disaster and misfortune. And you think about people who are immoral, eventually they're going to get into some type of disaster, or they're going to get into some type of misfortune just because they're immoral in the things that they do. And we know that careless answers can mislead other people, but it can also can cause harm. And you have to think about what you're saying and how you're going to say it. And it's kind of like polluted water source. If a person speaks without thinking, it pollutes the environment. And sometimes the pollution is not quite as evident as you would think. And you say something that seems innocent, but if you think about it, it's the wrong answer, or it's something that really shouldn't be said. So taking time to prepare an answer is keeping with the admonition that James gives in James 1:19. Let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak. And I think I think Bill's talked about this too. You need to engage the mind before you engage the mouth, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. Often there is more than one side of a situation, and we need to think about where we're at in this, and it's important to gather all the information as possible before giving an answer. And sometimes the answer would be, I really don't know. I'm going to have to think about it a little bit. That might be a good answer instead of just shooting from the hip. And there's a lot of good things about gathering information. When I teach a fire officer class, we talk about size up at a fire and making tactical decisions. You want to get as much information as you can before you make that decision. And if you look at the really great military leaders, they don't make the decision until the last possible minute because they want to gather all the information that they can before they make their move. And it's the same with this. If there's more information to get, take the time and get the information and give a really good, thoughtful answer instead of just shooting from the hip. So, listen to what the question is, and then think about what the answer is, and remember that our answers needs to honor the Lord when we make our points. Comments about that verse? Okay, let's move on then to verse number 29. It says, Jehovah is far from the wicked, but he heareth the prayer of the righteous. Now the Apostle Paul underscores this fact that righteousness and lawlessness are incompatible. You're either going to be one or the other. So is lightness and darkness, and so is Christ and the devil. And a believer's portion and that of an unbeliever, and in the temple, you need anyone could ask what their reason is, and that's one of the things that they did. So we have to remember that the Lord is holy, and he doesn't coexist with sin. So to distinguish from God being attentive, Solomon notes that God is far from those who reject his commands. He's not listening, and we're far from him when we reject the things he does. In Ephesians 2 and 12, Paul calls upon the Ephesians to remember that you were at the time separated from Christ. Before they were Christians, they were separated from Christ. And an unbeliever may appear to be righteous by attending church, doing prayers and things like that, donating money, but if they haven't followed God's plan of salvation, they're not righteous, and God is not going to, he's not going to hear their prayers. They think that they're close to God, but they're actually far from it, because by their disobedience they've alienated themselves from God. But on the other hand, the ones who believe in Jesus as a Savior is close to God, and God hears their prayers. God knows who his children are, and he listens to the prayers of his children. And as a matter of fact, God invites believers to confidently approach his throne, expecting both mercy and help, with our prayerful needs. We've talked a lot, and I think we all believe how powerful that prayer is. But for that prayer to be effective, you've got to be one of God's children, because those are the prayers that he's listening to.
People learn the lesson the hard way. Isaiah talks about a very familiar verse, chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. It says, Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, nor is his ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he does not hear.
Very true. Any other comments? All right, let's move on to verse 30. The light of the eyes rejoiceth the heart, and good tidings make the bones fat. So the phrase "the light of the eyes" refers to somebody who's happy. And you can look at somebody's face and the eyes tell the story. They might be smiling, but their eyes have got to smile also when they're happy. And looking at somebody's eyes, it shows, it's kind of a picture into the brain. And a characteristic look of a person's eyes, when they smile, it has to fit the description. The eyes and the mouth have to kind of match. In fact, in English, a person with a large smile is said to be beaming. The light is kind of shining. You can see it in their eyes. And when a person greets another with a big smile, we feel uplifted and joyful. With somebody who is happy, it kind of rubs off a little bit, especially when you're not feeling quite so good. But somebody who greets you with a big smile and is very friendly and all that, it has a tendency to lift you up when you're, when you're not feeling so well. Now, Paul understood how joy strengthens Christian bonds, and he urged the Philippians to rejoice, in the Lord. And that's something that we should be happy about, that that we're God's children. So we had two members of the Philippian church, and they were not getting along with each other. That's a bad situation, and they need to agree in the Lord. Now, that's what Paul was telling them there in the 4th chapter of Philippians, and that they need to rejoice instead of bearing a grudge. We shouldn't be mad at each other. If we've got a problem with each other, we need to work it out to everybody's satisfaction. And because, going around with a grudge against somebody is just not a good thing. It's not good for your mental thing. It's, they talk about people living in other people's mind rent-free. And, there's a lot of that going on these days. People get something on their mind and that they can't get away from it. And because of that, they're miserable. And it takes away from all the other things that they do. So just a warm and welcoming look can make a person, feel a whole lot better. And, so does good news. Getting some good news every now and then is something that is uplifting. And there's only a thin separation between one's emotional health and their physical health. If your mind's not in the right place, eventually it's going to affect your body. You can run yourself down. Good news encourages those who receive it, and in turn, the encouragement promotes some physical well-being. When you don't feel good and you think you're dying, and the doctor comes back and he says, you're okay. You'll get over this in a couple days. It perks you up a little bit. And I really believe that there's a correlation between your mental health and your physical health. And although Christians are not immune from diseases and aches and pains, the lifestyle, that naturally comes from following God gives you a better chance of health than it does, than, doing other things. Drinking, smoking pot, doing drugs, all that kind of stuff, it plays on your body. And if you're not doing those types of things, it's going to be better for your body. And it's not to say, that we don't get sick. You listen to the announcements that we do every Sunday morning, and all the sickness and all that stuff that's out there. But there's a correlation there where having a good lifestyle will help eliminate some of these things. And much of this is due to avoiding the natural penalties of sinful living. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that out there. Chemical abuse. You can even be a drug addict by taking prescription drugs and taking too many drugs, and things along that line. And sometimes I think we need to question our doctors a little bit more. Say, why are you giving me this medication? Things along that line. And doctors are not infallible either. So having a good mental outlook and a good physical outlook goes together. And go ahead, Bill.
This verse is almost a repeat of verse 13 earlier in the chapter. This is the first half of it, where it says, "A joyful heart makes a cheerful face. And when the heart is sad, the spirit is broken."
Mm-hmm.
Very much of almost a repeat.
There's a lot of good news in the Bible to read about. There's a lot of uplifting stories and things that, when you get down, you can't really think of a situation that we're going to run into in life where the Bible doesn't have the answer to the problem. But sometimes we have to study a little bit to find it, or maybe somebody has to point it out to us in situations like that. Any other comments about that verse?
Solomon, though, is really telling us to have a positive outlook on life. He's saying, don't go around looking for the negative or creating the negative, but have a smile on your face, have a good thought toward people, have a good outlook for the day. Don't be like the people that look like they were leaning on a sour pickle. And we see those people every day. We encounter those people every day. Don't be those people.
Well, and it's even I've met people that that've had really serious illnesses and things like that, and you would think that they would be in a bad mood, but they're in a good mood, and that rubs off on you, and it strengthens you and encourages you that I hope I'm that way if I get in a situation like that. A good attitude, and that when they have a good attitude, it doesn't bother them quite as bad. It helps overcome it. All right, let's look at verse 31. The ear that hearketh to the reproof of life shall abide among the wise. So to be considered wise, a person needs to listen to good advice. And that's, we always need to listen to good advice. And, sometimes we need to listen to different points of view because our point of view may not be the correct point of view. And if it's not good advice, you have to discern that. But, people that you respect and people that, that are good at something that they do, listen to what they say and try to take something from that. I know in all my years in doing fire and EMS and different bosses and stuff that I've had, I tried to take something good from that person, even if we didn't get along very well, something that they did good, and then on the other side though, something that they did bad that I didn't like, that I didn't want to do, that I didn't want to repeat. So we need to be open to listening to advice, and that means also godly advice, and it also includes correction. If you're doing something wrong, you need to accept correction, and that's there's some people that they've got the attitude I never do anything wrong. Those are the people that'll get you in trouble. So we need to be open to correction, and if we do something, everybody makes mistakes. And it shows that you're a better person when you admit to that mistake and you try to correct it. And there's a lot of godly wisdom in the Bible about how to correct problems that and mistakes that were made. There was a lot of mistakes that people made in the Bible, and Jesus kind of showed them how to correct it. In the Old Testament, there's a lot of mistakes, and there were it also shows how those mistakes needed to be corrected. So being corrected is not always a pleasant thing, but it's very essential to live in a righteous life. If we get straight off the path, then somebody needs to correct us and get it back on the path. And it may be an unpleasant experience. However, that's not as unpleasant experience as being in burning in the fire of hell for eternity. And it's kind of like we had a guy one time that we resuscitated from cardiac arrest, and 3 or 4 weeks later we had to go back to his house on a call, and he was complaining about how bad his chest hurt the last time that we came to pick him up. And the old guy who's the fire chief at Green Valley, his name was Bernard Grabman. I don't even know how he ended up on this call, but he looked at the guy and he says, "Leland," he says, "I'll bet your chest don't hurt anywhere near as bad as that shovel tapping you on the face." So, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, Paul commands Timothy to preach the word, to reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching. We need to listen to what Paul says when we need to have that. Then we need to have it, and we don't need to be afraid to try to correct an error that somebody else is making. Now, you got to do it in the right way, and that's sometimes that's where the wisdom comes in, figuring out the right way to make the correction so that you get the desired result that you want. And then we need to appreciate the reproof and the rebuke that somebody is doing for our benefit. We shouldn't get mad at them. We should love them because they love us enough to try to straighten out the mistakes that we're making.
Also, we need to kind of look at yourself and get that bean out of your own eye before you try to do somebody else.
Yeah, just make sure you're not doing the same thing. So we gain wisdom by examining our lives. We gain wisdom by how we learn how to correct people and doing it, doing it the right way. And there's a, there's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it. And I read an article one time. It was called "Being a 5-Star Critic," and it was talking about how you go about correcting problems without, making somebody mad or things like that. And it talked about, you don't want to do it at the end of the day. You don't want to do it on a Friday at the end of the day, because the people are going to go home and they're going to, think about you to do it early in the morning. You do it in a certain way, and then you go back later on to let the person know that, it's nothing personal. It's, just something that needed to be done. You're not mad at it, and you don't hate them or anything like that. And, there was a lot of wisdom in that, in that article. And after reading the article, I kind of thought about my boss down at Hart. He must have read that article, because I tell you what, he could tear your rear end as good as anybody. And down there was called Ream, Steam, and Dry Clean. And but the thing about it was, he would always do it early in the morning. He would always make sure that he got back to the office to sit down and talk to everybody a little, especially whoever got the rural treatment. And, just to make sure that, everybody knew it wasn't personal. It was just, it was something that needed to be done. And we just had a reunion here a couple weeks ago, and it's been over almost 45 years. And, we were talking about that. I mean, looking back on it, we were a bunch of kids. We really were. And he knew how to keep us going, because we had a really good unit. And that was probably the best job I ever had, and that shaped a lot of things in my future, just from the things that he did. Learned a lot from the guy. And needless to say, I can tell you, I made a lot of mistakes, and did a lot of things. Lord, if we did things today in EMS like we did back then, we would all be in big trouble. It has definitely evolved. We refer to those days as the Wild Wild West. So correction is a very important thing. All right, let's move on to verse 32. He that refuses correction despises his own soul, but he that hearketh to reproof getteth understanding. Another translation of that is he that refuseth instruction despises his own soul, but he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. So the Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew and under an ancient culture. And the concepts of love and hate expressed in English are not necessarily the same words that we use today. Now, in context, despising something is not about emotion. It means to prefer something else or go against that thing's, go against your best interest. Now, Solomon indicates that to ignore the wise teachings of the instructor is to hate yourself. You really don't hate, you're really not hating yourself. That's probably not a great translation of the word, because that's not the emotion, or that's not the meaning that Solomon really had in the Hebrew. So the arrogant person who dismisses good advice may think that he is superior to the instructor, but actually he's insulting and harming himself, and he doesn't really know it, because he doesn't know any better. There's you don't get to be the instructor for without having a little bit of more knowledge than sometimes your students do. So this is like a very sick man who tosses aside the only medicine that can make him well, because he thinks he knows more than the doctor. And that's kind of the situation that we're talking about here. Whereas to refuse instruction is to despise oneself, deprive yourself of intelligence, and to accept it as to gain intelligence. You reject it when you really should be gaining it. And it often involves reproof. And of course, reproof means to be corrected. And this is not always pleasant, like we said, but it's a necessary part of learning. You learn a lot more from the mistakes that you make than you do from just sitting reading about it. Reading about it is one thing, but doing it is something else. And when you're doing it and you mess up, then that's when you really learn. And hopefully you learn from your mistake and you don't make the same mistake twice. So near the close of his earthly life, Jesus wept over Jerusalem because they refused to receive him as the Messiah. And I mean, there were some that did, but the vast majority, they couldn't see that he was the Messiah. You think about the Sanhedrin. Those were the wisest men supposedly in the area of religion. They should have recognized Jesus instantly as the Messiah based on the prophecies that I'm sure that they knew very well, but they didn't see it. And part of the reason they didn't see it is because they didn't want to see it. It didn't fit their narrative, as we would say today. And as a result of that, they had a closed mind, and they didn't see Jesus as the Messiah. They were just plain unwilling to accept the instruction that Jesus was giving them. And he was pointing out all these things. I mean, would we have picked it out back then? I don't know. But even today, you look at the majority of the people, they basically rejected Jesus, and they don't care one way or another. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 33. The fear of Jehovah is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor goeth humility. So reverencing the Lord, there is a personal gain of wisdom in doing this. But you must be humble, to gain this wisdom. That humility that you don't know everything is part of this. And you have to be willing to acknowledge our reliance on the Lord for wisdom, and we need to humbly obey the instructions that the Lord gives us. Humility is a great thing. And a person cannot start from an attitude of arrogance and expect to gain honor. People do not like people who are arrogant, and people who are legends in their own mind. The humble people are the ones who a lot of times you're drawn to, and you get somebody who's a very humble leader, and they're pretty easy to follow. Now James insists that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. That's in James 4 and 6. And when Jesus entered the home of Mary and Martha, Mary was the one who sat there humbly at his feet and listened to his teaching. When her sister Martha complained that Mary wasn't helping, to serve, Jesus kind of got on her a little bit and said, look, she's taking care of the important stuff. What you're doing, it needs to be done, but it's not as important as what Mary's doing. She's humble. She's listening to the things that Jesus says, and she's drinking it in, because I think she, somewhere deep in her heart of hearts, she realized that Jesus wasn't going to be there for forever, and she took every opportunity to gather in the things that he was saying and serve him. And when we do good deeds and we humbly do good deeds, that's something that pleases the Lord, and that shows that we have understood the instructions, and it makes us a better person. It puts a good light on the church, and it puts a good light on God, who is our leader there. So God is going to exalt everyone who humbles themselves before him. In Luke 18 and 14 promises that everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the ones who humble himself will be exalted. So there's a lot to be said there about being humble. And Jesus assures his disciples that preeminence is in the kingdom is the ones who are humble. And we talked about, and we read and studied about, the disciples were all kind of jockeying for position, and Jesus had to kind of put the stop on that about who's going to be the greatest. Well, the ones who are going to be the greatest are the ones who are humble. Jesus humbled himself quite a bit to come here to this earth for our benefit. And it's not going to hurt us a little bit to be, to be humble. Comments about that verse? All right, so we got a couple more minutes here. We'll do a little bit of modern technology here. Bill doesn't do modern technology. He's old school. Okay. All right. So, chapter 16 here continues Solomon's record of concise statements about wisdom. And the segment begins with a discussion of man's plans. And we know that human nature can lead us to arrogance and ignorance, and failure to seek God's will or examine our own motives can lead us to disaster. And despite that, despite what a person might tell ourselves, the Lord sees the heart. He weighs the spirit and determines, what will happen. And of course, we know that the Lord is sovereign, and He has a purpose for everything that He has created. And God detests arrogance, spiritual pride that causes a person to reject God, but is pleased when one turns away from evil. And godly wisdom is better than any type of material wealth that we've got. In the first 9 verses, that's going to kind of be the theme. Solomon's going to offer several perspectives on kings and rulers, and points out the fact that those in authority have great power, so it's common sense to avoid their wrath whenever possible. And some of these statements are expressions of ideals and the ways that godly kings ought to act, and that's kind of in verses 10 through 15. So next, kind of a series of proverbs relate to the values of wisdom, controlled speech, and self-reflection. And we're going to talk about arrogance leading to disaster, since it prevents a person from following God's will and recognizing their own errors. All right, so let's start with verse 1. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from Jehovah. So a person can draw up plans the way that a military officer arranges soldiers in formation. However, the outcome of those plans is beyond human effort. It ultimately depends upon the Lord. And when someone devotes their heart, their mind, and their soul and strength to God, God is going to guide that person's speech and conduct. And of course, all persons are free to think as they will, but the future is ultimately in God's hands. God is in control of the situation, where we know it or not, or whether we like it or not. And the Apostle James, counsels us to seek the Lord's will before drawing up our plans. And in James 4:13 and 14, he writes, "Come now, you who say, tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life but a mist which it appears for a little time and then vanishes?" So, we can make all the plans that we want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that it's going to be, because God has control of the situation. So instead of arrogantly assuming that our plans are going to be invincible and absolute, we need to follow the counsel that James gives us in the next part. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we live and do this or that. So that's important. So we'll stop there and pick up next week with verse 2. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.